everyone. Welcome to the Charlotte Mason Show. I'm your host, Julie Ross, and I am here again with the amazing Shay Kemp for our book club, Chapter 7.
Yay! Woo! I wish we were at a coffee shop sitting together.
I know, right?
Doing this. It would be super fun.
So I have to tell you, Shay, in Texas at the homeschool convention, I had several people come up who listened to our podcast who wanted to know if you were there because they wanted to meet you.
Oh, I wish I could have been there. Yeah, we had such sweet.
So they're like, I want to fangirl over Shay too.
They just wanted me to speak in my flat accent because I would fit in there.
You actually probably would, yeah. But no, it was encouraging to hear that people are listening and that people really appreciate hearing, even if they're not reading for themselves, they like diving into what Charlotte Mason has to actually say in her volumes, and that people are, reading these with the book club and things. So that was really encouraging. So thank you all who are following along with that. Shay and I really appreciate that. So chapter 7 is called How We Make Use of Mind, which you actually have to make use of your mind quite a bit because this chapter is very hard, right, Shay?
There was a lot of Googling of names and phrases and pronunciations when I was studying this chapter because I had never heard of Herbart before. And the funny thing is I read this chapter before, and I think I must have I read this volume several times. I'm 100% sure I skimmed this chapter those times. 100% sure I skimmed them because I'm like, there's no notes here. There's only a few little asterisks and underlines from where I read it before. So this time I really dug in and tried to really extract as much as I can. And it is really, there's a lot of great deep information here, though, if you can plod through it.
Yes. This chapter, I really had to make use of the annotated version that the Charlotte Mason Plenary puts out. I was very grateful I cheated. I'm very grateful for her little notes of who people were and what this thing was, because there's a lot of people and a lot of names that Charlotte Mason references that her readers would have known about. So she's talking about all people that are currently living, in the early 1900s who are coming out with the education philosophy. This is post World War I. So she's writing this, kind of reflecting back. Would education have made a difference? Let's look at the education of these countries that were involved in the war. How are they different? How does education kind of shape a nation? And so her contemporaries would have understood what she was saying in this chapter. The people that she was lecturing and writing to. Us, on the other hand, 100 years removed, are like, what in the world is she saying? So hopefully we'll be able to kind of give you a little bit of information and hopefully break down a little bit of kind of what she was saying in this. But yes, it's one of those chapters you don't want to read right before bed. You want to have lots of coffee and time to kind of think through, research, and understand a little better. But she opens the chapter with principles 9 and 10. So she says, we hold that the child's mind is no mere sack to hold ideas, but it is rather, if the figure may be allowed, a spiritual organism with an appetite for knowledge. This is its proper diet with which it is prepared to deal and what it is able to digest and assimilate as the body does food stuff. So that's principle number 9. The mind is a living spiritual organism. It feeds upon knowledge. And then principle 10, she's comparing her view of the mind to this Herbart guy, which we'll get into. Mm-hmm. He believed that the mind was like a blank slate. It's a receptacle. It's like an open thing. And that the stress and the burden of the education is on the teacher to mold. And she's saying children taught on this principle are in danger of receiving much teaching, but little knowledge. The teacher's axiom being what a child learns matters less than how he learns it. So it's more focused on the methodology than the actual knowledge and content that children learn. So let's dive in right now to this Herbart person, because she says right away, I cannot, in big letters, resist presenting the Herbartian psychology in the dry light of Scottish humor. I love her sense of humor. She's like, this guy is completely off the wall. I don't agree with him at all, but I'm going to have a sense of humor about it.
Yes, let me tell you about it. And I have so many LOLs written in this chapter because some of the stuff that she says is just funny and it's very dry wit that I think,
she always reminds me of like the Dowager on Downton Abbey.
Yes, 100%. Yes. So he lived from 1776 to 1841. And I think what's interesting is he was homeschooled by a tutor to age 12, which is interesting.
I did not
He
know
was
that.
a German psychologist and influenced educational theory. And he had what he called the 5 formal steps of the recitation. So basically, he comes up with this idea of there is something about psychology to education, not just it's something we do, which was a new concept for this time.
True. Yes.
This was a concept that other than just we read books, we do the things, why it was thinking about what is behind the education. And so for us, especially who have been through teacher college, you have to go through educational psychology and all these methodologies and stuff. I do not remember learning about Herbart back then, but I'm sure he was in some dry textbook.
Yeah, I don't learn about it.
We can, understand that of course there should be some philosophy behind education. But I do think for homeschoolers, in many times, this is a new concept that there is a psychology behind education and there's a philosophy behind education. If you're not new to Charlotte Mason, then you understand it as a philosophy. But if you are new to Charlotte Mason, you may have just considered curriculum or methodology. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the psychology and philosophy behind the methodology and how that affects the methodology. And she's comparing those two things.
Yes. So it's interesting. A name most of us are probably more familiar with is John Dewey, who was an American educational theorist. And if you've ever studied educational theory at all, you've probably heard his name. And it's usually not in a positive light.
Right.
But he wrote about Herbert in his writings, and he said that educational theory often has this opposition between these two concepts, that education develops from within or it's formed from without. So he says there's these two contrasts here. The first one holds that education is grown from within, that children are born with, like Charlotte Mason says, children are born persons, they have this seed-like potential, and it's the role of the teacher to provide a rich environment, the right materials, and then these seeds will grow. The second theory is that education is largely a matter of controlling the input from without, that a child is a blank slate. I think she uses like the Latin tabula rasa, right? Yes. And that the teacher is writing these messages. They're forming like a lump of clay. This is the teacher's job. And you'll have, so you can see Charlotte Mason and Herbert in this article, but like John Dewey, Piaget, Maslow, all these, B.F. Skinner, all these other educational psychologists that are going to come out after this book was written will also kind of fall in one of those camps.
Right. And one of the things that I really think that she points out is the difference in the role of the teacher.
Yes.
And Herbert, magnified the office of the teacher is the way she puts it.
The teacher's doing everything. I feel bad for the teachers using his approach because that's exhausting.
Right. And how he's done this whole thing. He says every child is a new creation as he comes forth from the hands of the teacher.
Ooh, that's scary. Isn't that scary?
It is so scary. And I remember being afraid of even that concept when I taught school. That was scary. Those weren't my children. Like, I'm responsible for, it's all on me. I'm a good teacher, a bad teacher, depending on what these kids get from my class.
Well, I think homeschool parents feel that too, right?
Yes, I was going to say
the other day about that, right? That like they feel this pressure of how my child turns out is going to be on me, and it's like it is. You can't have that pressure on you.
Right, and it is a switch of a mindset, to keep telling yourself that and recognizing that, when you do see yourself as somebody who's been entrusted with a child that's born a person, all these other principles we've discussed before then rather your job is to provide, not to control outcome.
Correct.
And, that's a big difference in perception. about
And I think
how you
too,
place your date.
given the fact that this is in Germany, right, can
Mhm.
make sense to some of the later things that are going to come up in schools after World War One in Germany, in just terms of, changing the textbooks to be anti-Jewish, and the, kind of zealous patriotism, and nationalism, like that. Children's minds are very malleable, right? And like Charlotte Mason talks about, that's a huge responsibility on us to provide this feast, but not be saying, you must think this way, and
Yeah.
giving them all the opinions on everything, but letting them come to the ideas and chew on the food for themselves. And respecting their personhood is very different than, I see that children are these blank states, so I'm going to kind of, in a way, use that for a certain purpose. And that's
Right.
very
And
scary.
that you have an outcome already in your mind, which
Mhm.
is one of the biggest things I think is a hurdle people have to jump over when they consider educating with the Charlotte Mason philosophy, because, we get asked the question, where are the worksheets?
Mhm.
Where are the discussion questions?
Right.
Where are the, and she talks about that, in the back part of the chapter, she goes on these different, she talks about Germany, France, Switzerland, Scandinavian group of countries,
Yeah.
and what the outcome of the mindset, which ones are saying, okay, here's the feast, here's the presentation of ideas to
Yeah.
feed you with, and who says, this is the outcome, how do I get you there?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the contrast between those two things.
Yeah. So, and she's kind of saying, okay, I'll just read this quote here, but she says, Herbert's psychology is extraordinarily gratifying and attractive to teachers who are, like other people, eager to magnify their office.
Mhm.
So in a way, it feeds the teacher's ego, is basically what she's saying, because all of it's on me. And if they turn out great, it's all because of me, and I can take all the credit. And, I have to be the fountainhead of knowledge. So I need to know everything. And, I'm going to booster myself up with all my educational magic that's happening, right?
And she even uses the word entertainment on the next page. She said, this is where I wrote LOL. The whole thing must be highly amusing to the teacher, as ingenuous amplifications, self-produced, always are. That the children too were entertained, one does not doubt. Acting, and she was in fact acting a part, and the children were entertained as at a show, cinema, or other. And then she goes on to say, yeah, we're entertaining them, it looks great, the actor's like, yay, you get applause, good for you, get a sticker, the teacher's amazing. But we can be sure, this is when she's particularly talking about that, she references like a Robinson Crusoe basic unit study.
Yeah. Can you read some of those lessons that were included? I was dying laughing. I was
too.
I would poke my eye out if I was a child in this class. Like, I would be so bored.
And it is really funny the way she says it. It is extremely clear that she is speaking this with a sarcastic tone when you read it. She says, we have 9 lessons in literature and language, 10 object lessons, a series of drawing lessons, a series on manual training. We're going to build a seashore. Then we're going to read an infinite number of lessons. Then we're going to do some more writing lessons. We're going to frame sentences on the board. We're going to compass, she just goes on and on. Then, of course, we go to arithmetic. Everything that they could pull out of Robinson Crusoe, this teacher possibly could have done, they pulled out.
Arithmetic.
Yes.
Like the nature study lessons on the sea and caves, and then the composition. That was hilarious, because she was like, here's one example of a composition. Robinson spent his first night in a tree. In the morning, he was hungry, but he saw nothing around him but grass and trees without fruit. On the seashore, he found some shellfish, which he ate. Compare this with the voluminous output of children of 6 or 7 working in her programs upon any subject they know, which indeed the pages they will dictate after a single reading of a chapter of Robinson Crusoe is not this child's edition.
And I think that's a very clear comparison of what happens when you give someone a living book, no matter the subject, whether it's the fictional Robinson Crusoe or a living book that is nonfiction about nature or whatever. And the comparison between you saying, tell me what you know, show me what ideas fed you from this particular meal, and saying, okay, write a composition. It's so clear there. And I've seen this in my own children. So the way we boil this, and this was what I really tried to do with this chapter. I'm like, what does this have to do with me, with my school this year? So my takeaway from that is be aware that you're not trying to extrapolate information just to pass on to your children, but you're allowing them to do, like she says here, come up with these, give them this, and then let them come up with this. What did they say? Dictate after a single reading. And don't dumb it down to a child's edition.
Right.
She makes that so clear. Let it be the pure literature and let them say what they need to say. And it doesn't always start with the voluminous output. So if you have a child of 6 or 7, you're not getting a voluminous output, it's all okay. But
that's a good point to make.
I love that.
Yeah. And I think too, and she does it too with like a lesson on an apple and all the things. So according to Herbert, the teachers had these 5 steps they had to do. So they had to prepare the material and kind of draw it back to what they had already learned, which, I do that all the time too. Like if we're reading Heidi, I'm like, okay, what happened the last time we read Heidi? Because I'm, it might be a couple days. That's not what I'm saying here is what's happening. Like the teachers, okay, let's review. Here's the 5 points of what happened in last chapter in Heidi. Okay.
Right.
So the teachers having that responsibility to present that. Then the teachers presenting the new material, and it was supposed to be actual experience, concrete objects, again, this is show here. And the association was the 3rd step. And that's where the teacher's going to help them take this new idea that the teacher determined is going to be the new idea from the lesson and attach it to another idea. And that's where, like you were saying with the Robinson Crusoe, this unit study concept of how can we connect it to math and how can we connect it to science? Let's do a drawing lesson on it. Let's listen to some music about it. And I'm doing all the work of connecting all these things to help your brain make connections. And so Herbert was on point in one respect that our brains retain information. We know things deeper when we make connections amongst different subjects. He failed in the fact that he was having the teacher make those connections rather than the child. They're not as meaningful. They don't make a big of difference if they're not the person themselves making those connections in their brain. If somebody arbitrarily does that for them, then the brain isn't making those synaptic connections. They're just kind of going in one ear and out the other.
Yes, they're not long-term. And she even addresses that. She says, one thing we may be sure, an utter distaste, a loathing on the part of the children ever after, not only for Robinson Crusoe, but for every one of the subjects lugged in to illustrate his adventures. And the same thing with an apple. She's like, the apple is worn out. She says, no kid ever wants to eat another apple when we've, worn out the apple. No kid is ever going to read Robinson Crusoe again. Like, oh my gosh, we've been talking about. And listen, I'm guilty of this.
Me too. Because that's what we learned how to do in teacher college. I learned how to write unit studies. I mean, I'm not going to brag, but my dang unit study I wrote for 2nd grade on oceans was awesome.
Come on, girl.
I got an A+ on that.
Yes, thank you. You should see mine from kindergarten. I still have my lesson plans. It was like, okay, A, apple. We're going to wear this apple out. And I thought, oh, this is going to be so fun. The kids are going to love it. But here's where.
And they might love it because it's fun.
But
they might love it.
They're entertained.
They're entertained.
But she says
they're not learning. They're entertained. There's a difference.
Yes. They're amused. But the failure is that they're not fed. It's like we've laid them a table full of desserts. Any kid would love that. Come on in and eat every single sweetmeat, but we're feeding them a poor diet because we are not giving them anything with meat. And she calls it sweetmeats.
Yeah, I love that quote. She says, the children like feeble and tedious oral lesson, feeble and tedious storybooks. Does not at all prove they are wholesome. So just because they think that book is so fun and they love it and they can't get enough of it, it doesn't mean it's wholesome food.
No.
They like lollipops, but they can't live upon them. Yet there is a serious attempt in certain schools to supply the intellectual, moral, and religious needs of children by appropriate sweetmeats.
Yes. And that's exactly what I think I didn't understand that I was taught to do, but that
no, me either. Because I was a great teacher if they liked it and they were entertained, right?
Yes.
That was the goal.
But what the result is, she talks about a little later is, it says, it's a scheme that throws the whole burden of education on the teacher. It exalts the personality of the teacher as the chief agent in education, which affords ingenious, interesting, and more or less creative work to a vast number of highly intelligent and devoted people whose passionate hope is to leave the world a little better than they found it. Yes, that is exactly right. That's what I wanted to do. I loved my job, and I love when I made the mistakes in homeschooling. I loved it. But it's very appealing, she says, to like the educational committee. Of course, like, look how great this teacher's, look at this great show thing we have.
Yeah.
But it later gives rise to dismay and anxiety among thoughtful people. It looks great in practice, but the result, and I know you and I've talked about this many times, and is burnout.
Yep. Oh yeah. Not just teachers, I mean, I think the average teacher lasts 3 years now. And that was for me. I mean, I burn out within 3 years of teaching in public school, but also homeschool parents too burn out.
Yes.
Because they're doing it all themselves and they feel that they have to do it all themselves. They don't realize you're actually not going to get what you want, the results that you're after here, because all this pressure you're putting on yourself, there is an easier and different way. And then there were 2 more steps real fast of the Herbert thing. There were 5 steps. So it was preparation, the teacher doing all this work of connecting all these ideas, the presentation, the show, and then the association, helping the students make all these arbitrary connections. The 4th step was generalization. And this was for older students, that we want to take them beyond the concrete. How can we apply this to a variety of different subjects here? And then the last one was application. And it, okay, here's the idea from this lesson. How can we apply this to your life? And I just, I cringe. I think of like reading a story and being like, okay, so Heidi was really upset about whatever. How can we apply this to your life? Oh, this kind of reminds me of the time that you forgot to do blah, 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 blah. And maybe you could act like Heidi next time. Let me tell you. Right.
You're moralizing because you're pulling out the ideas yourself.
Correct.
And, so many of even the devotionals that we read, and it's why we rarely use devotionals with our children, because they're reading the script, they're showing the scripture, and they're telling me what I need to get from that scripture. I'm not saying we don't do Bible study, of course, absolutely not. But when my children read that, I'm just particularly talking about scripture, I need to trust the divine teacher to show them what they get from that particular thing. I don't need to moralize and preach and give them some sort of point, because
it's like that with everything. You have to trust the divine teacher in grammar and math too. She's saying, that whatever it is that they're going to take away from this is theirs. It's their idea to chew on and grow and make those connections.
Yeah. And I wish that I had, understood that earlier, even in my homeschooling years, because, you go to a homeschooling store or you go online and you pull up and there's all the bright, shiny curriculum that I all promise.
The vendor hall, the convention is like, whoa, sensory overload.
It's like, oh, maybe I need this, maybe I need that, maybe I need this, and so much of it is teacher driven. It's teacher driven, it's preparation driven. And we do prepare for lessons. I'm not saying we don't. Charlotte Mason teaches that, but it's so teacher driven that you're burned out. And I remember very clearly my children were young. I would prepare this amazing lesson. I'm like, oh, this is going to be so great. Okay. I ran off these sheets. I have this activity, this thing. I bought this.
I've cut it all out myself.
Yes. Laminated, girl. I mean, I'm telling you, we got a notebook, the markers, everything ready to go. I'm so excited about this. And my kids are like, well, why do we have to build that?
Yeah.
Because it didn't feel natural.
Right.
It's not a natural connection. It needs to be from me. Yeah.
I'm glad I wasn't the only one to do that. Yeah. Okay. And then she talks about, so it was a really interesting time, like I was saying, that Charlotte Mason is writing this. So right before she wrote volume 6, there was a educational act that was passed in England, the 1918 Education Act, that transformed education in England. So before then, mandatory school age was only up to age 12. So this act made it up to age 14. So in our minds, that still seems really young, right? But by then, they would go to work or they would go to like a university. Mm-hmm. So boys, let me rephrase that. So, this was, they're adding on this kind of extra time for adolescents. So, she's going to start kind of brainstorming, well, what should that look like? What education should look like for 12 to 14-year-olds? And at the same time, a book came out called Across the Bridges. And she quotes that here. She talks about Mr. Patterson. So that book is about the underprivileged youth in London and how this education can't just be for the upper class, that the lower and middle classes now have access to education up to age 14 for free. This is a whole radical idea here, and so what should that look like? What should be afforded to all people, which was something that was Charlotte Mason, which I love about her, was super passionate about too, that all children deserve this.
Right.
And so in here, she talks about continuation classes. I think she even uses university at one point.
She does.
And so you might read that. And I did at first glance too, thinking they were talking about college.
Right.
And that's not what she's talking about here. She's talking about high school, really. Yes. Not even, 12 to 14, that's like what, junior high, upper,
right,
8th, 9th grade. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And Patterson, talks about some of the quotes that he speaks in here that she shares are really powerful. One that says, the teacher ready to use the powers that his training and experience have given him works too hard, while the boys share in the struggle is too light.
I love that. Mm-hmm.
I do too. And, it is possible to make education too easy for children. Mm-hmm. And to rob learning of the mental discipline, which often wearies, but in the end produces concentration and the capacity to work alone. So if we ask anybody that's listening, do you want your child to have mental discipline and have concentration and the capacity to work alone? Every single mom's like, yes, absolutely. This is the end game. This is what we want. But what we often do is we're making it so easy. It's like you never are strengthening the muscles that you expect your children to strengthen.
Yeah, because they don't have to chew the food. It's like the mama bird vomiting the food, doing all the work, and then vomiting it into the baby bird's mouth. Like, if a child is just an empty receptacle, they're just a blank slate, it creates a passive learning. Like, I'm just going to sit back here, tell me what's on the test. I'll pay attention maybe. I don't really care about any of this stuff. Just feed me what you think is important and what you think the worldview should be, that I should think about this, and tell me what to think. And I regurgitate it back to you on a test. And then I forget about it. It creates this whole passive learning system where Charlotte's like, no, the children need to come to the meat themselves, and they need to chew on it and digest it themselves. That creates that mental discipline. She says, like, children are rarely left alone with a book. And they can't think for themselves because they're so dependent on someone telling them what to think.
Right. And, we wonder why there's burnout we wonder why. It's because like you're dragging a whole child's education behind you plus the child, right?
Yeah, like I got like 5 children strapped on my back here.
Yes, and I'm carrying all you guys. And that's one reason I'm really so grateful that I came to this philosophy, after only a few years in of homeschooling, because I think I would have been, she says, it's dispiriting to master and boy alike. And I'm like, yes, I can see that you get dispirited by the fact that you're just constantly trying to come up with what the next thing is to make them, as passive, remain interested. And it really is an impossibility. It's just not going to happen, which I think we see in our educational system across most of the world today.
Oh, yes, for sure. So she kind of gives her idea of what she thinks this education for these older children look like. She actually has a whole chapter, I think it's in volume 2. We'll double check, we'll link to it in the show notes, but called continuation course, or continuing education schools, or where she really breaks down further what she felt like should be happening at these ages in these schools. But she's basically, to boil it down to, and what Mr. Patterson, who kind of spearheaded this movement, was saying, was that they need like a university education, basically a wide feast, an education in the humanities here. These junior high years should not be specialized, only going to learn like whatever skill you need to go be a banker or a mechanic or whatever. Like, they need this wide feast still at this age, and probably more so than ever. She says, talking about this university education, we're not just preparing them to be a soldier or a banker or these things. Their implicit contention is a well-educated man with cultivated imagination, trained judgment, wide interests, and he is prepared to master the intricacies of any profession.
Yes.
While he knows at the same time how to make use of himself, of the powers with which nature and education have endowed him for his own happiness, the delightful enjoyment of his leisure, for the increased happiness of his neighbor and the well-being of the community. He is not only, and that man is able not only to earn his living, but to live.
So powerful.
I know, I got goosebumps.
I know, it really does. And I just look at that, and I mean, I think that is my heart for my own personal children.
Yes.
Because there's my children are doing some things now, my grown children, I never could have prepared them for and taught them in my school to learn. Aeronautics and working on airplanes and flying airplanes and all that stuff. I don't even understand it. I just get on an airplane with the wing and a prayer. I'm like, oh gosh, but I think about this, but if you are preparing their minds to think, like she says, a well-educated man with a cultivated imagination, they're not going to be with us forever. They need to be able to go into a profession where they can learn that profession, learn that skill, learn that, not just that, but like she's talking about, this flows all the way over to family life. It affects our whole society, our whole community, when we allow people to be active learners and not passive learners.
Yes. And I've quoted that before, because people, often ask, like, will this actually work? Like, will my child be able to like get a job and go to college? And we get this question a million times. And it's like, yes, but also think through, what is your end goal? My end goal is my child to have a life and be like all these things she just listed, not just to make a living and make it through the day and pay their bills and then move on. Like, I want them to be these magnanimous citizens that she talks about. And so I quote this study a lot in my talks. So if you listen to some, you've probably heard this before, but for those of you who haven't, I want to mention it because I think it's so interesting that when Google came out several years ago, where they surveyed their top employees and what skills they had that made them successful employees at Google, out of the 8 skills they tested for, STEM skills came dead last. And all the top 7 skills were what we call soft skills: the ability to empathize with people, the ability to think outside the box, the ability to express ideas, and all these things that are like, oh, this is a Charlotte Mason education. Like this, and like he's saying here, this is preparing them for any profession here. You need these skills. And the Google is saying that these are the people we want to hire. We want to hire people with humanities degrees now because we realize these skills are way more important than we could teach you the technology, right?
Yes, exactly. You can read a manual and learn from it if you have understood how to extrapolate ideas for yourself out of a really well-written book.
Correct. Yes.
And so that's why it's so important that we provide the feast. And she, not particularly here, but she makes this point other places, is we don't ever know what our children are going to end up doing. That's why we provide a feast. Okay, maybe I don't love foreign languages and maybe they're really frustrating for me or difficult for me, but I'm not going to leave that out because I'm not interested. I'm going to put that out there on the table as part of the feast because I don't know what my child will take away from that. Mm-hmm. Or whatever the things are, or maybe the folk songs or the whole wide range of things. Yeah. Because we don't know what they're going to need.
Yeah. And that's so important. And like we had said at the beginning, she looks at what other countries have done for this age group and said, okay, well, what have they done and how has that turned out? And again, it's after World War I. So she's really comparing here. So she talks about how in Denmark and other Scandinavian countries, she says they have a generous policy of educating young people, not according to the requirements of their trade. So again, it's not this specialized knowledge. Oh, you like this, so now this is all you get to learn. But according to their natural capacity to know and their natural desire for knowledge, history, poetry, science, art. This is natural to everybody. We have this curiosity within us. We have this desire to know about these things. And the success of the experiment, now a century old, is an object lesson for the rest of the world. So they've been teaching kids this way for 100 years now. Let's look at them and what they are doing and the results of the people that are coming. And then she says, Germany has pursued a different ideal. Her effort too has been great. So they're very serious about education and the way that they're going about this philosophy. They are unified by the idea of utility. And if we will only remember the lesson, the war has shown us how futile is an education which affords no moral or intellectual uplift, no motive higher than the learner's peculiar advantage in that of the state. Germany has become morally bankrupt for a season only, let us hope. I mean, if she only knew it was going to be coming here. Right. Not solely because of the war, but as a result of an education which ignored the things of the spirit or gave these a nominal place in a poor rendering in a utilitarian syllabus. So it's this utilitarian syllabus, again, is focused on the utility. What work are they going to do? What can they do? We're going to spend our time focused on this. If we're not going to give them this wide feast, and she's saying what happens is they're morally bankrupt because, again, they're only getting this knowledge that's very practical, but doesn't apply to their soul, right? It doesn't change a person. When you have living ideas, it changes you as a human being. I interviewed my daughter a couple episodes ago, and she's in college now, and we were in Ambleside, England, and we're getting all touchy-feely, and so I'm like, let's talk about Charlotte Mason in school and stuff. Right. But it was super sweet. But one of the things she said was her favorite book was The Girl of Limberlost by Porter, and that book's used for nature study. And it's told in a narrative story. It's this beautiful story, and it brings in a lot of nature things, but it's told in a narrative story fashion. But so that kind of struck me as odd, at that being her favorite. And I said, well, why that book? And she said, well, that book changed me the most as a person. And I was like,
and you never would have known that.
Oh, I had no idea.
Right. And you didn't have these lessons. Okay, we're going to read Girl Limberlost, and then at the end of the chapter, here's some questions, and then you and I are going to discuss, like, how could this book possibly change you as a person? Which it sounds great. I mean, when you say it says, oh yeah, okay, I need to do that. But the outcome that we want is not going to come from that sort of education. I'm not saying that there's not good outcomes that come from it. I mean, I was educated that way, and there were some things I got from my education, right?
Yeah.
But I did not learn to think and to pick up on ideas in that sort of education.
Right.
And so I think that's such a powerful example.
Yes, right. All right. So, are there any other closing thoughts? She has a couple more pages here. She goes back to the Robinson Crusoe idea. She talks about these other different countries. Was there anything that struck out for you for these last couple pages?
I think I love when she goes back and she talks about she says the case for continuation schools, as strong as it may be.
Continuation schools. I knew it was something like that. I was so close.
That's it. Yes.
That's the chapter in volume 2.
Something, yeah. She says, but there is a more excellent way. And, I underlined that because, yes, I really feel very strongly, and I follow Charlotte Mason's philosophy because I do feel like it is a more excellent way. Mm-hmm. And there are easier ways sometimes, it feels like, to do things, rather than going through and making sure that the books are a living book, or providing the wide fees, setting up schedules and stuff like that. I understand sometimes it's easier. It would be easier just to hand them a textbook and say, here's your history, just read it. Look.
Yeah, here's some video of someone teaching this to you. Just watch
just watch it, just answer it. Okay, just do it. Mm-hmm. But it's really important to me that I do it in a more excellent way, because I am considering the outcome, which she really addresses in this chapter in a powerful way. Mm-hmm. Looking at the other countries, looking at the use of the psychology. And so I think that's important to consider, that it's worth the effort that you put in. And it is actually less effort.
Yes, exactly. That's the key.
It is actually
this is so complicated. I'm like, no, this is easy.
The work is done. Like right now, I'm getting ready. We're going into cycle 3 for the second time. And I mean, I'm a planning nerd, so I will, admit that. Bought a new planner, some new pens, got some stickers, only for my own. It's just my own entertainment. That's all it is. It has nothing to do with anything. It's just my own entertainment. But this is the part. Okay, well, this book, yes, she needs this book. Yes, I mainly follow straight through A Gentle Feast, unless we've already read a book or we're doing something a little different in co-op. So now's when the work is done.
Yes.
And then, making sure my routine is set up. Yes. But then when the actual school days begin, it truly is smooth and easy. Yes. Other than the attitudes of your own children, which we're
or your own attitude, right?
True. Yes, very true. Other than that stuff, but we're just solely talking about the effort of the teacher.
Yes.
It truly is. Yes. Yes, my effort is truly less, and it's truly a joy to read these books and watch the connections that they make. Which makes you have longevity in homeschooling.
Yes.
I really think that's the reason I have been able to continue to do this our 19th year, and we have been able to do it for that long, because it is not a strain.
Yeah. Yeah. So she just kind of concludes here. She concludes with a letter by John Stuart Mill. One of the things I love in it that, I read it last night, actually gave me goosebumps, but now I'm reading from this annotated version, so I can't figure out where I underlined it. Where did it go? Oh, okay. So it says, after all, life is very short. We all of us have only one life to live. Yes. And during that life, let us get into ourselves as much love, as much admiration, as much elevating pleasure as we can. And in view of education, if we view education merely as discipline and critical bitterness, then we lose all the sweets of life, and we shall make ourselves unnecessarily miserable. There is quite enough sorrow and hardship in this world as it is, without introducing it prematurely to young people. So it's not that we, live this Pollyannic thing and we don't ever teach our kids about hard things. That's not what she's saying here. But there is so much beauty, truth and goodness in this world. And this is what, and because life is short, right? We need to be savoring these things every day with our children.
Yes.
And this is what is going to change them as a human being and change us as a human being.
Yes.
Changing me. It's changed me.
Yeah, me too.
And I thought that was really, I got a little teary.
Powerful.
I got a little teary reading that last night. Actually,
Powerful.
there is so much beauty and so much goodness in this world, but our time with our kids is short.
And I know that sometimes when I talk to homeschool moms and do consultations and stuff, you just want an answer. What tell me what to do.
Yes.
Just tell me what to do. Like, tell me what to do at 8 a.m. Tell me what to do. And somebody can tell you what to do. That's fine. You need help with routines, but you're going to burn out and you're not going to enjoy, like she's talking about here, these sweets of life if you don't consider your view of education more than merely discipline and critical bitterness. If you will take the time, like I'm really proud that I dug through this chapter and looked up the names and tried to understand like how to chew on this for myself and get these ideas myself, because it's going to make my homeschool better, because I can approach it from a point of view as philosophy. And then I'll understand the why that I'm making these choices and why am I asking you to do this thing today? And the more I get that, and we've said this over and over again, I really think this is one of the passions of my heart, is the more confident I'm going to be at my dining room table.
Yes.
On Monday morning with my children, which is where the world has changed,
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, at the conventions, just talking to people. I had a lot of people who had young children who came up and they're like, oh, we're just here kind of thinking we're going to homeschool. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what an amazing opportunity you guys have.
Yes.
Because you can do all the research of what math curriculum is the best. And, does this book have good reviews and whatever. If you don't have an educational philosophy, you're going to be tossed about by the wind. So I'm just telling these people, this is now the time to think about what you truly believe about education. Research Charlotte Mason, research the classical philosophy, research John Dewey, research everybody. Like, what do you actually believe? Because that is going to guide you. And now you have the time to do it, because unlike us who kind of just fell in the deep end and kind of had to learn how to swim and figure it out as we went.
And made so many mistakes as we went, like, oh man, I should have never done that.
Yeah. I'm like, you guys have a great opportunity. And then, people come up and they'll ask me a question or they're like, oh, hey, I'm doing like XYZ for our narration. Is that okay? And I'll be like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Or, oh yeah, like, keep on doing whatever. And they're like, oh, okay. Well, I just need to know what I was doing was okay. or that I was doing it right. And I'm like, you knew, right? You are the best person to be teaching your children, right? Like if you don't want to, you feel like they need an extra time to narrate was one of the questions. And you want to go back and, the child really was just having a rough day. They weren't paying attention, but they usually really pay attention. You go back and reread it. Charlotte Mason said not to ever reread. No, come on, people. Like, this isn't a box. This isn't a prison here. Like Charlotte Mason said, your children are yours. You know them better than anybody else.
And there is no lightning.
Divine teacher's telling you to read it again, right? Like, it was never meant to be this like oppressive system. I think so many people get into that mindset. And like you're saying, like, I just want someone to tell me yes or no. Is this, rather than I get it. I've been there myself. And Charlotte Mason said this too, like, she'd be like, I'm not going to give you a list of the top 100 books that you should read. Like, I'm not going to tell you how you like with her teacher, she was training and her teacher, I'm not going to tell you how to redo that lesson. Like, you have to at some point go, okay, this is the philosophy we're going with. I'm researching it. I'm growing as a person, but I'm also in cooperation with the divine teacher here. I'm going to take a leap. I'm going to trust that I'm going to be guided throughout our day of what it is we are supposed not to. And it feels more comfortable. It feels safer just to follow this formula, but that isn't what she's talking about here. This isn't a formula. She's talking against that actually in this chapter.
Yes. And I mean, I feel like we've said that over and over again. This is not a system. This is not a system. This is not just a curriculum. Even we're just talking about a gentle feast. And, I'm like, it's not just a curriculum. This is a way to follow philosophy. Yes, it's a beautifully laid out plan for you, but we want to be your servant. We don't want it to master you,
Yes, right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to
it's a joy.
Dive into this meaty chapter. And we will see y'all next month for chapter 8.